I'm Ken Bueller, and this is In Business, a weekly news, discussion, and feature presentation. And we thank you for joining us. Make Mine a Fitkers was the last advertising slogan for Ficker beer, brewed right here in this big copper kettle since 1881. The 10-second TV ad, voiced by John LaForge, showed a bottle of beer being poured into a glass, and those words, "Make Mine a Fitkers." Well, the bottle ran dry in 1972, ending what was Minnesota's longest continuous brewery. Oh, there was that little interruption. It was the 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act, that dried up America in 1920 and began a 13-year failed experiment called Prohibition. And we all know how that worked out. Well, there's a new prohibition on the horizon. The one passed as part of the bill that ended the longest government shutdown in American history. The amendment would basically outlaw the fastest growing segment in the adult beverage market. It was introduced by Senator Mitch McConnell, a Kentucky Republican who's retiring. This new prohibition is set to go into effect on November 12th of this year. And that's our program this evening on In Business. Welcome to In Business. I'm Ken Bueller. Thank you for joining us. Fitkers was one of only a handful of breweries that survived Prohibition and returned to brewing beer in 1933. To make it through, the owners turned from beer to candy and soft drinks. They opened a boxing ring, a training gym, and found creative ways to keep the business alive. That kind of strategy probably won't work today if a new federal ban on hemp-infused beverages goes into effect later this year. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at the proposed federal hemp ban, set to begin, by the way, in November, and what it could mean for breweries and beverage makers here in the Northland. To learn more, we'll tour a local brewery and see firsthand how THC-infused drinks are made and what a ban would mean for one of the region's largest brewers. Our discussion continues with a local cider house and a representative from the Minnesota Craft Brewers Guild. And later, we'll take you inside an underground speakeasy in a most unlikely place. A reminder of how Duluth kept spirits high by keeping spirits flowing during Prohibition. Our first stop, though, right here in Duluth. This is In Business. We're in the western sections of Duluth, Minnesota, beautiful Lincoln Park, and we're with Brian Tonis. Brian is the guy that had the Bent Paddle in Bent Paddle and is one of the founders and CEO and one of the people that worked on producing THC drinks. Thank you for letting us come by and tell us how all this works.
Yeah, so we're in the main production facility here at Bent Paddle, about a half a block away from our tap room. In the original space, when we first opened 13 years ago, we produce beer here, but we also produce hemp beverages. It's a larger and larger percentage of what we produce as the industry changes, as the beer industry fluxes and everything. And so we produce everything here. Basically, the process starts off over here in the brew house, just like when you're producing beer. Only we're just producing water as the base stuff. So we can add flavor ingredients, we can add sugar, we can add various other things. So think of it as kind of like making soda, right, if you pop. So we start off on the brew house. We boil the water, the filtered water that we use the same water to make these beverages as we do our beer, 100% Lake Superior water. And so we filter it, we boil it to sterilize it. And at that point in time, we go through the process of basically trying to remove all the oxygen from it, just like a lot of other beverages that are made, because oxygen will kill any beverage that you're putting in a new package or stuff. So that's what happens here. That part of the process takes roughly about an hour to an hour and a half. And then from there, we move on down and we cool everything down in a heat exchanger. And then it rolls down this process through here. We start injecting CO2 into it, start removing a little bit more of the oxygen that's in it. We can also do pH adjustments to get the beverage to where we want it flavor-wise. This not only helps with shelf stability, but also the flavor side of the beverages as well.
What part of the process then is the THC ingredient added?
So the THC is added after we make it through this entire part of the process. We come down into these tanks right here, which are the bright tanks. This is where the process differs a little bit from beer. Beer, we produce basically wort, which is unfermented beer. We add yeast, and we ferment it for anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the beer we're producing. We skip that entire process for this beverage. And so the beverage goes right into these tanks. We scrub them to make sure we remove as much oxygen as possible. carbonate them. We testing throughout the entire part of the process. Everything's done in a food safe manner, like we do all of our other beverages. And that is when we add the flavoring, and then the last thing we do is we add the THC. And there's some other cannabinoids that you can add, CBD, CBN, CBG, into it. And so what we do is we take a sterilized brink, and we add the emulsion into it. We do all the calculations to make sure that we hit the potency exactly where it needs to be. We take it and we basically mix it into the tank, stir the tank up with everything in there. We have a mixing protocol that we go through.
So it's a brick of the THC product?
We get it in liquid. You get so what the processors that we use, we have two of them that are located in the Twin Cities that we use. They use predominantly Minnesota, Wisconsin-based hemp. So they take the raw flower from the hemp plant and they process it. They extract out all the oils, and then they distill that into the different cannabinoids that you can get out of hemp. Small percentage of it is THC. They take that, they distill it, separate it out, and then they put that through an emulsifying process. So they combine it with different emulsifiers that are food-based, food-grade emulsifiers, to basically make the particle size as small as it can possibly be so it stays in solution within the beverage. So we do that, and we infuse everything in there. And at that point, once we get the infusion done, that's when we take samples out, and we send them off to independent labs to make sure that we hit our dosing correct. One thing we did find out is that certain raw materials that you add flavor-wise in there can interact overall with the product and decrease the potency a little bit. So sometimes we need to give things a little bit of a bump to make sure that we're at the proper dosage for what's on the cans, the beverages we're producing.
Brian Tonis, one of the founders of Ben Paddle, its CFO, and your brewing experience goes back a long way.
Yeah, roughly 25 years.
And now you're in charge of production for Ben Paddle. Yeah. How did you ever get into doing THC products?
I definitely enjoyed the products back in college. And being in the beverage industry, when the laws changed in 2018, we started to look at it as a beverage company. And then, as the laws changed in the state of Minnesota, we were ready to dive straight in. The industry, the beer industry specifically, has changed quite a bit since COVID. So production's been down a little bit. People have been exploring other beverages, other means of relaxing, and we decided to jump in head first.
And now, if this prohibition goes into effect, what does that do to Ben Paddle?
Well, production of these beverages makes up about 40% of our revenue as a company. And so if prohibition does go through, we are going to look drastically different as a company if that happens. It means layoffs, means maybe even possible closing our production facility, laying off a bunch of employees. I don't really like to think about it, but it's definitely something we need to look at as the deadline draws near.
Welcome back to In Business. To continue our conversation about the potential impact of a federal hemp ban, we're joined by Adam Rulin, co-owner of Wild State Cider, and Bob Galligan, Director of Government and Industry Relations for the Minnesota Craft Brewers Guild. Thank you both for being here. Bob, you started with the brew pubs back in the day, and the Guild has grown now in 26 years to over 250 members. If a ban on hemp-infused beverages goes through, how does that change your industry?
Rather drastically. I do want to be very clear that obviously not all of our members are operating in this space. Numbers are kind of hard to come by, but we estimate about 70% of them are. Some of them, it makes up a little bit of their production or sales, about 10%, but there are a fair amount of folks out there where it makes up a majority of what they're making now. So it would greatly impact the industry, and a lot of, I think, one of the more surprising things is some of the names and the players that it would really heavily impact. It's some of the larger and kind of more historic breweries who are in this game already. So
we'll come back to that a little bit more in a minute, but I want to know, where were you when you found out about this potential ban, and were you surprised?
Yeah, I was actually up here in the North Shore trying to take some time and disconnect when all of a sudden Mitch McConnell attached this to an appropriations bill, which is not necessarily how we were anticipating this happening. I will say, we passed language in 2023, and I go to D.C. at least once, twice a year, and we've been trying to have this conversation. We've been trying to promote the Minnesota model and kind of show people the success that we've seen here in Minnesota. It's always been a topic of of discussion that we know was going to happen in Washington as to how this was going to play out and what it would look like. So the topic of actual hemp ban has always been kind of hovering in the air, and how do we deal with it? But having said that, again, kind of the pathway that it took was not preferable, and that kind of came out of nowhere and threw, I think, everyone in the industry for a bit of a loop.
Adam, you started Wild State Cider in 2019. When you put that into motion, did you ever think you'd be making hemp-infused products?
Not at all. It wasn't on the radar for us, and we actually got into the industry, very excited about cider becoming a national cider business. And when the Minnesota regulated these products prior to 2023, we started seeing some activity. And we're very cautious about jumping onto a trend and having it fizzle, but we saw more and more people doing this and realized maybe there's something here, we need to explore it further.
And I believe the product name is Birdie?
We have Birdie, yep, and we've got a new product called Otter, so there's 2 brands now coming out of our operation.
And how has that grown to be a percentage of your overall business with the cider?
Every year since we started has been an increasing amount of our business. It's the fastest growing part of our business, and we'll be at just under half finishing off 2025.
So this ban would have a drastic effect on you too, just like we heard from Ben Paddle.
Yeah, you scale up your business for the volume you're producing, and to have half of your business sort of at risk is a huge concern, as you can imagine.
We are in business, and we're talking with Bob Galligan from the Minnesota Craft Brewers Guild, along with Adam Ruland from Wild State Cider right here in Duluth. And Bob, according to the Guild, Minnesota brewers rank 11th in the nation as far as the economic impact they bring to the state, in this case Minnesota. Without THC products, what happens to that ranking and the breweries that make it happen?
So really, really good question, Ken, actually. The actual number that ranking comes from is all through TTB reporting, and all we have to report to the federal government is going to be our beer, because that's alcohol production. Currently, we don't have to report THC numbers to anybody. So as to how that would all shake out, it would be interesting to see. But I will say, again, with some of the larger players having to kind of pull back on production or, having to lay off staff and whatnot, I would imagine we would see that number, dwindle a little bit. Having said that, Minnesota has always punched above its weight when it comes to the actual craft beer numbers. I think we would continue, seeing us in that range. But having said that, things would definitely change, and I think we would definitely see some shifts for sure in production numbers.
One of the things that I would like you to explain is if this hemp ban goes into effect, how can that be in Minnesota, where a state that's already approved cannabis sales?
Yeah, so the thing that Minnesota did, the very first state to do so, actually, was we actually crafted language that very specifically separated hemp from cannabis. It comes from ultimately the same plant. It's just hemp has a lot less THC product in it. It's kind of a younger cousin, I guess, in some ways. And so by addressing that actual difference in definition, that allowed us to operate in a whole different model because it was federally legal. So when you step into the cannabis space, you then are subject to like tax provision 280E, which says you can't write off any of your business expenses. We hold a TTB license. We could not hold that TTB license any longer because it's a federal illicit product now that we would be operating in. So basically what this ban does is it takes that legal definition of hemp and it kind of throws everybody into cannabis at that point. There's really no point in staying in the hemp market at that one.
And does this potential ban affect other products that are hemp made, and what might they be?
Yeah, it impacts everything hemp-based. I think one thing that not a lot of people realize is that actually part of the reason why even cannabis geneticists can work and work in their seeds and ship those across state lines is because it's technically hemp. It doesn't have a high THC potency, so the genetics market on the cannabis side would be absolutely decimated. And also the minor cannabinoid market, so CBD, CBN, CBG, all of those would be greatly impacted, if not borderline impossible to produce under this new language. So there are other aspects beyond the actual hemp beverage world that this really heavily impacts.
Let's go back to Washington, D.C. for one more quick question, Bob. And that is, there are 2 bills, as I understand it, that have already been introduced in the House. One would reverse altogether the ban, and the other one would delay it 2 years. Which one do you like best, or better yet, what's your legislative strategy?
Our legislative strategy is get it done. We're going to see what that looks like per se, but ultimately we are strong champions of regulation. I mean, the main concerns that people have with these products are completely valid. We want to make sure that children don't have easy access to these products. We want to make sure they're correctly labeled, correctly tested. So we want to see a bill of some sort that really solidifies that and allows people to feel comfortable where they purchase these products, no matter where in the country. Having said that, if we also just need a little bit of time to really figure out what that regulation looks like, we certainly are not opposed to that. The end game ultimately remains the same, and we're anxious to get to work on what it looks like.
Adam, what are your customers saying about this? Are they familiar with it? Is it something they talk about? Do you hear from your guests what they're saying about this?
Yeah, there's a lot of attention that we see as people in the industry to this ban and what's happening. But surprisingly, I think there's so many other things going on that are attracting people's attention politically right now and just in general that I don't think customers are fully aware of what's about to happen and the broad impacts that this has, not just on not being able to get their beverages in a year from now when the ban goes into place, but also other products that they might be purchasing and not have any idea that they could be impacted.
How do you personally feel about this? Are you worried?
Absolutely. I have employees. This is my livelihood. There's so much on the line. So, for us, it's important that as a business, we think that we're positive that change will happen, a delay or a bill regulating further. But at the same time, we were hopeful that a ban would never happen, and here we are. So as a business, we're certainly looking for ways to diversify. We're not going to put all our eggs in this basket. We have a year's time to figure it out. But obviously, we would love to continue growing this segment of our business.
And there is also like the Craft Brewers Association or Guild, there's also a cider association. I assume they're working on this too.
Yeah, there's a cider association. There's only a few cideries in Minnesota of a certain scale. So there's a different group actually called the Minnesota Hemp Beverage Producers Association. This is a new group that's focused on, the Brewers Guild has a broad membership base. We are members even though we produce cider. This hemp beverage group is very specific to people that are manufacturing hemp products. And we have state issues that we're focused on, but obviously we're very focused on our existence, being around in a year from now.
Bob, one of the things that's been talked about is, and you said it earlier, Minnesota is a leader in the regulation. And that is one of the things that maybe that 2-year postponement would allow the federal government to set standards. Explain a little bit about Minnesota's legal environment and what the regulations are that may be adapted nationwide if it works.
Yeah, and there's a lot of discussion to be had in Washington, D.C. on a number of issues, but obviously in hemp too, as to what regulation might look like. I think at the end of the day, everyone wants these products to be 21 plus marketplace available. I think everybody does want some sort of potency cap. What that cap looks like, I think, is up for discussion, and people have differing views. But ultimately, we want to make sure again that whatever the consumer is purchasing, they know what they're purchasing. That ultimately, I think, is the end game. And we just want to see ultimately regulation. We know that, as this whole entire episode is focused on, we know prohibition does not work. We know that regulation does. And so really kind of not copy and pasting, but really taking a step from the alcohol industry as to how we have regulated this and how we report it and how we test it, I think is crucial, and I think really important. And I think a really good stepping off point is the Minnesota model.
The Minnesota model was crafted how?
A lot of conversation and a lot of drama, as most large bills are. Ultimately, in 2023, when the cannabis bill was reintroduced, it was kind of known that something was going to move just because the Democrats had the trifecta. We wanted to make sure that just hemp wasn't left out of that language, especially because in 2022 there was a bill that kind of opened the doors for Minnesota producers here in the state. That is part of the reason why a lot of our breweries kind of stepped into that space. And then our legislative priority number one is always don't lose any rights you're currently granted. So the hard work then fell on our shoulders to actually get regulating because we wanted to make sure that we were protecting our ability to do this. So we worked with a lot of stakeholders, including cannabis folks and other alcohol folks, in trying to find what the Minnesota model would look like. And like I said, we did not get it perfect. We are well aware of that, especially after this licensing period in October. But having said that, again, I think it is a good stepping off point.
Bob Galligan is with the Minnesota Brewers Guild, and we thank you for being here. Adam Ruland is one of the co-founders of Wild State Cider here in Duluth. We thank you both for coming. We know that both Minnesota Senators Amy Klobuchar and Tina Smith have come out in favor of reversing Section 781, banning THC beverages and other hemp-infused products like gummies, edibles, and certain other concentrates. We reached out to Congressman Pete Stauber's office here in the northern part of his district and also at his office in Washington, D.C. for a comment and have yet to hear back. Before we head to tonight's final story, here's a quick look at some top business news from across the region. Douglas County officials are considering higher penalties for businesses that fail to renew required licenses on time. The county's health board has recommended increasing the late fee from $85 to $125, citing a sharp rise in late renewals after the past several years. The proposal, though, still requires additional approval by county leaders. The city of Duluth has been awarded $11.2 million in federal infrastructure funding to rehabilitate the aerial lift bridge. The grant brings the city close to full funding for a $20 million project that will replace walkways, repair the bridge deck, and extend the life of one of Duluth's most iconic landmarks. On the Iron Range, Hibbing Taconite will lay off 45 workers in February. The Cleveland Cliffs operated mine cited restructuring and operational needs for the job cuts, which include both hourly and salaried positions. And in Hermantown, the City Council has approved a permit for a new cannabis cultivation facility. The indoor grow operation will be built near Highway 53 and will supply a Duluth-based retail location. During Prohibition, businesses were forced to adapt or disappear, and Duluth found its own creative ways to survive. We started our program this evening talking about a new form of prohibition, and we're going to end with a look back at the original Great American Experiment. To do that, we visited a very trendy place today with a history of being a very trendy speakeasy back in the day. Duluth was dry long before the passage of the Volstead Act. It was July 1st, 1917, and Duluth went dry. Now, an earlier law already had forbid the sale of alcohol to women. Now, Superior, they got into it real early. 1915, the city of Superior decided to give up the booze. But Superior's in Wisconsin, so the idea only lasted less than a year and they repealed that law. But the law did come into effect nationwide. And Duluth, Superior, they were already experimenting with being dry cities. Now, of course, it didn't end drinking. It just went underground. That's why we're here in the Rathskeller, in the basement of one of Duluth's historic buildings. Because as I said, drinking didn't stop, it just went underground, into the basement. And in the basement of this building, built in 1889, kind of important. And why? Well, because in the first year of Prohibition, 1920, John Murphy is arrested. He's indicted. He's tried. He's convicted of smuggling booze. And why is that important? Well, you see, John Murphy at the time was Duluth's chief of police. His office was right upstairs. Prohibition wasn't for the rich. Take the example of the Kitchigami Club just down the block. Downstairs in the basement of the Kitchi, in the tap room, there were little individual lockers where members could hide their own stash of hooch and then have it for any special occasion they wanted, which could be any night of the week. Up in Bovee, on Minnesota's glorious Iron Range, and CBS did a story on this a couple of years ago when they were remodeling what is today Annabelle's Antique Mall. In the basement, they found a secret passageway, a tunnel that connected to another building next door. Why? Well, because back in the day when that was a hardware store, there was a speakeasy in the basement. And that tunnel, the perfect escape route when the feds came to crash the party. Watertown, South Dakota took that to a whole new extreme. They used the steam tunnels under the entire downtown to hide hooch, move booze, and have a party. And, of course, evade detection. Minnesota has a lot to do with Prohibition. Mitch McConnell, of course, introduced the possible new prohibition, the ban on cannabis-infused drinks. But in Minnesota, we got Mitch beat. We had Andrew Volstead, after whom the Volstead Act is named. He was a 7th District Minnesota congressman and the abolitionist of Prohibition. He was the Prohibition prohibitionist. And even after the bill was passed and bared his name, when it was finally repealed and he went back to private life, he went back to busting booze. What'll happen this time? I already said there's a bill that's been introduced that would extend the deadline past November 12th for the imposition of this bill. What will happen? Well, we'll wait and see. I'm Ken Miller. Thanks for watching In Business. If you missed any parts of tonight's show, you can always watch it at pbsnorth.org or listen on Mondays at 5:30 on the North 103.3. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, let's take care of each other.